For as long as humans have been aware of making music, we have been asking ourselves where our music comes from. Was it a gift from the gods? And if so, where did they get it from? Is it the voice of the soul or the spirit? Did we learn it by imitating other animals? Peoples of all kinds have pondered these questions for thousands of years. Now, in the late 19th century, following the publication of Darwin's work on the theory of natural selection, ethnographers and anthropologists started to look at music from the point of view of an evolutionary adaptation. Now, at the time, the popular theory was that maybe music had evolved through sexual selection, as some sort of musical peacock's tail, if you will. The Darwinian approach to this question fell out of favour in the wake of the Second World War. As Ian Morley puts it in his book, The Prehistory of Music, for social and political more than practical reasons. And so for the second half of the 20th century, most theories advocated for a purely cultural basis to music. Now, what do we mean by this? Something that we might consider a cultural invention rather than an evolutionary adaptation might be something like writing, which we have evidence of only having been invented a handful of times around the world, and that many cultures happily do without. And most that do have it acquire it through cultural exchange rather than simply inventing it spontaneously. So the dominant idea now was that music was maybe something more like writing or other human inventions. However, in the meantime, in 1973, John Blacking, a musician turned social anthropologist, published a short book titled How Musical is Man, which was a book based on a series of lectures that he had given at the University of Washington. And it was an unexpected success at the time, and was likely one of the contributing factors in the resurgent interest in ethnomusicology that occurred over the 70s and 80s and 90s. Now, in this book, he observed how the capacity for music is something that is common to all human cultures. By capacity for music, we mean both making music and listening to music, the ability to find it beautiful, to understand it, to find it meaningful. It's not just that other animals don't make the kinds of musics that we do, it's also that they don't seem to find them as compelling or captivating or beautiful as we do. And both of these are, in a sense, part of the human act of making music, or, as it's sometimes called, musicking. The fact that this musicking is common to all cultures would seem to imply that its origins are much more ancient than any one of these cultures, and that, in a sense, it precedes culture as we think of it. In his book, Blacking states, "It seems to be that what is ultimately of most importance in music can't be learnt like other cultural skills. It is there in the body, waiting to be brought out and developed, like the basic principles of language formation. It is there in the body." Consider what it is that he's getting at with this. In this view, music is not merely a cultural invention, an invention that some cultures have and others don't. What he is talking about is some sort of music instinct that we inherit from our ancient past. In this case, rather than writing, music would seem to be something more like language. Each culture has its language, or many languages, which do develop through cultural means. But these languages emerge spontaneously, and they would not even exist if humans did not have an innate, pre-existing capacity for language that is common to all humans. So when we say that it is there in the body, we don't just mean that we have the physical ability to talk or to sing, but also that within ourselves, we have the desire to do so. Even the most cursory glance at humans across the globe today will immediately tell you that it's not just that we have the ability to do these things, but that we have an instinctive desire to talk and to make music. Now, over the course of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, a number of sometimes quite disparate fields of studies began to converge on this question of the origins of music and of its evolutionary past. Until in 1997, the Institute of Biomusicology, based in Sweden, organized a workshop in Italy to bring together experts from all of these different fields. And this effort was spearheaded by two musicologists, Niels Wallin and Bjorn Merker, and a neuroscientist, Stephen Brown. Now, to give you a sense of how new a lot of these things were, the Institute of Biomusicology itself was only a couple of years old at the time, and was itself the result of a similar attempt a couple of years earlier to organize a gathering of this kind. Now, the main areas of study that the 1997 conference in Italy drew its scholars from were musicology, naturally, biomusicology, that is the study of music-like behavior in animals, ethnomusicology. Now, you can think of this essentially as the equivalent of anthropology, but applied to music. Other specialists also came from the fields of neurology, and in particular paleoneurology, that is the study of ancient brains, from zoology, anthropology, and language studies. During this workshop, a number of papers were presented and discussed, which formed what is still now much of the groundwork of the study of music origins today. These papers were all collected and edited into a single volume by Wallin, Merker, and Brown, which was titled The Origins of Music. So, this conference in 97 is pretty much year zero when it comes to the contemporary study of music origins. And so today we'll try to give a brief overview of the field of study that emerged out of this. Now, first of all, we need to understand what are we asking when we look at the question of the origins of music. We should not, for example, expect to be able to draw a direct line from discussions on the origins of music or discussions of evolutionary factors that may have played a role in its past, all the way to specific styles of music that we hear today. Perhaps an analogy will help to understand this point a bit better. Let's say that you were studying cuisine, and you were interested in knowing why a certain dish is cooked the way it is in a specific region, then you would likely be better off studying the cultural history of cooking in that area, rather than human evolution more generally, which would likely not have much to tell you about that specific dish. On the other hand, studying the biology and evolution of humans might tell us something about much more general human eating patterns, how often they eat, why they tend to eat certain things rather than others. In the same way, we won't have much to say here about specific forms of music, but we will be looking at more general patterns that are often just taken for granted when discussing specific pieces of music. As Ian Cross puts it in Music, Mind and Evolution, evolution can be thought of shaping our mind and our behaviors at the level of our innate predisposition, with culture then shaping and diversifying the way in which these predispositions are expressed. These cultural expressions can in turn impact the environment or the evolution of the species, leading to what Gary Tomlinson calls biocultural evolution. Now, returning to the question of music origins, in simplest terms, we can say that in the animal world, we find examples of sounds which may on the surface resemble musical sounds, but that lack many of the core characteristics of human music. For example, other animals do not seem to have either the ability nor the desire to synchronize their vocalizations in time with those of other members of the group, or in time with an external beat common to all of the performers, which is one of the most common features of human music, what we call rhythm. So there would have been a time when our very remote ancestors were not the musical animals that we are today. On the other hand, if we took a human from maybe even as far back as 50,000 years ago and raised it in a contemporary society, then they would almost certainly gravitate towards the music of the culture that they were brought up in, and do so with the same ease as anyone else, and they would learn music with the same ability that we do. So, in the time between our split with our closest common ancestor, with the chimpanzees, about 7 million years ago, and the late Paleolithic, changes would have occurred, transforming us into the musical animals that we are today. Now, going back before primates, and even before mammals, it seems that once animals had evolved ears that allowed them to hear, and mouths and limbs with which they could produce sounds, that this rapidly developed into a rich system of communication. Animals communicate in many ways. Some use visual displays, or they mark their territory with scent. But there are many animals for whom sound is one of the primary methods of communication. Sound is used in a dazzling variety of ways, in territorial displays, in trying to attract a mate, in signaling the presence of food or other resources. And much as with mutual grooming, vocal communication and vocal play seem to have a role in strengthening the bonds between the members of a group. Animals vocalize on their own, they vocalize as part of a group, and sometimes even in elaborate male-female duets, which are usually found in monogamous species. The most complex duet singing found in the animal kingdom is almost certainly that of the Siamang gibbon, what Marshall and Souhk called probably the most complicated opus sung by a land vertebrate other than man. The singing of the Siamang gibbon tends to be female-led, with the males repeating a number of phrases that increase in complexity as the song proceeds. At more or less regular intervals, the females interject long calls of increasing tempo and pitch, known as great calls. The males often remain silent during the great calls and then resume vocalizing after the end of a call in a sort of call and response form. At the climax of the great call, the partners often engage in acrobatic displays and vigorous branch shaking. If you want to get a sense of how powerful these calls can be, this next recording of agile gibbons, close relatives of the Siamangs, captures the moment in which the female great call erupts across the forest. Now just imagine actually hearing that sound in a dimly lit tropical forest just before dawn, which is when gibbons do most of their singing. Now, Siamang bouts of singing tend to last somewhere between 10 and 30 minutes. However, they can last longer, and in a paper on gibbon songs, zoologist Thomas Geisman describes a single bout that he recorded lasting a full 86 minutes. As Geisman's paper points out, we still don't fully understand why the Siamang produces such complex songs, though there is some evidence that it may be related or contribute to pair bonding, which is also consistent with behaviours observed in some other duetting species. However, what is also noteworthy about the gibbon song is that, unlike, for example, in birds, where singing behaviour is pretty common, singing behaviour is very uncommon among mammals. And even among primates, where it is a bit more common, it is still only found in about 6% of primate genera. However, it does seem that primates do have a certain facility for evolving into singing animals, as singing behavior in non-human primates is found in 4 different genera, and it seems that it evolved independently each time. And if we add humans to that list, then this would mean that singing behavior evolves at least 5 different times in the primate family. Now, unlike what you might be thinking, the great apes, our closest relatives, and the old world monkeys are not classified among the singing apes. They do all exhibit a rich repertoire of great calls, but these usually take the form of short bursts, lasting a few seconds or perhaps a bit longer, but they're too short and therefore undeveloped to be classed as fully fledged songs. However, these calls do still share many of the features common with the more complex songs of gibbons and other singing primates. We find, for example, accelerating rhythms, which are then followed by a final slowdown after the climax. Or we find alternating rhythmic sounds, which are produced by vocalizing both on inhalation and exhalation, such as the famous chimpanzee's pant-hoot. And as with gibbons, the calls are often accompanied by a variety of acrobatic displays, leg kicking, branch shaking, vegetation throwing, chest beating, and thumping or drumming on the ground or on trees. So even though these calls may be shorter, they can still get pretty intense. Now, in orangutans, long calls are generally produced by males. Low-frequency bubbling noises that build up into a series of high-intensity calls before descending once more. In gorillas, series of hoots are most commonly produced by silverback males who often use physical displays to conclude the calls, sometimes chest beating, other times branch breaking or running through foliage. In common chimpanzees, the pant-hoot is performed by both sexes, but most often by males, and they will sometimes accompany themselves by drumming on trees or on logs. These primate calls are designed to travel very far. Many can easily travel up to a mile, sometimes even more, and they seem to play a role in long-distance communication between individuals and between groups. In chimpanzees, for example, calls have been observed in a great variety of contexts. On rejoining other members of the group, or encountering other chimpanzees from outside the group. They are heard when an individual or a group of individuals finds a particularly abundant food source. They're heard during territorial displays or in competition between males. They're heard upon capturing prey, and they also likely function as some sort of long-distance territorial marker advertising the presence and the sex of individuals. The size of the territory, for example, held by a group, seems to be correlated not just with the number of individuals in that group, but also how far their calls will carry through the forest. So, Geismann's hypothesis, which he presents in this paper on gibbon singing and primate calls, is that this repertoire of loud calls that is found in the primates, this pre-existing body of vocalizations, is the substrate out of which singing behavior would have evolved multiple times in primates, including in humans. He looks not just at the sounds primates make, but also at the ways in which they exhibit acrobatic displays and branch shaking while calling, and he reflects that music too has a powerful, almost hypnotic effect on performers and audiences alike, compelling them to shake their body in time, or to beat or clap or stomp the rhythm, and to engage in acrobatic displays of dancing. The distinction between music and dancing, which we find in Western culture, likely came much later, and in fact is not even found in all existing modern cultures. After all, it is just as impossible to make music without moving as it is to engage in acrobatic or energetic dancing without making sound. Is a performer who is stomping their feet or slapping their body to produce a rhythm dancing or making music? It is compelling from the evidence of primate calls to imagine that at the time when early hominids were splitting from our closest ancestor with the chimpanzee, that their vocal displays would have shared many characteristics in common with the calls of apes and other old world monkeys. And that sometime after this split, a number of characteristics of human music evolved that are not found in the calls of our closest relatives. One of these unique aspects of human music is the presence of a steady beat or pulse. Even other singing primates, though they may exhibit song patterns that are very rhythmically complex, they don't synchronize these patterns to an external beat that is common to all the performers. While human musicians and dancers across the world do this every day without skipping a beat, literally. This ability to entrain one's calls and movements to an external beat is the focus of a paper on chorus calling among mammals by anthropologist Edward Hagen and biologist Peter Hammerstein. Their primary aim is to better understand the communal aspect of music. As we have said, many of the earliest attempts at constructing a more or less scientific theory on the origins of music in the late 19th century imagined music to have evolved originally maybe as some form of sexual display or through means of sexual selection. However, as Hagen and Hammerstein point out, if music evolved primarily as a sexual display, we would expect it to be first and foremost a solo activity, or sometimes a duet activity, as is seen in some birds. But in humans, we find quite a different picture. Music is commonly performed by groups. It is danced in groups. And in societies where there isn't a distinction between musicians and non-musicians, often the entire community takes part in music making together. Whether that be by singing, playing instruments, clapping along, dancing, and most likely a combination of all of these at the same time. And even in the West, where we differentiate between musicians and non-musicians, when people go to concerts, they sing along and they dance to the music. Now, they may not be thinking of it in this way, but in so doing, they're taking part in the performance. When we listen to music, we often also sing along, or we imagine ourselves performing. We've all sung in front of the mirror or danced along to music when no one is around, and imagined ourselves to be in the thick of the musical frenzy. Music is a communal activity which compels us to join in. Even today, when technology makes it possible for us to listen to music while completely alone. So to seek the roots of this behavior, they look at other animals that vocalize in groups. Among mammals, this is found most prominently among some primates, as we have seen, and in the guild of social carnivores. In taxonomy, a guild is a group of species that exploit the same class of food resources in similar ways. This means that they often share similar lifestyles and they develop some common behaviors. The guild of social carnivores includes 4 large-scale hunters: lions, spotted hyenas, grey wolves, and humans. All of them lived in groups. They slept in caves, often even the same exact caves, just at different times naturally. We sometimes find caves that were first used by hyenas for denning and then later by humans, or vice versa. And all 4 exploited the same prey species. Now, all 4 of these species have also been observed to vocalize in groups as part of their territorial displays. Again, as these species aren't closely related, then the chorus calling almost certainly evolved independently in each case. Experiments were conducted with lions by placing loudspeakers playing the calls of unfamiliar lions within the territories of different lion coalitions. In each case, the lions were found to respond to these simulated intrusions by cooperating in group vocalizations together, sometimes also aggressively approaching the loudspeakers and modulating their behavior depending on the number of perceived intruders in the recordings and on the strength of the defending pride. Wolves also very famously engage in chorus calling, in extended bouts of group howling. The howling can indicate many things: the presence of a kill or of food, rejoining members who split off for a hunt. It can vary on the composition of the pack or on the presence of young and so on. And even though it is not observed in direct response to perceived intrusion, the frequency of these calling bouts and their long carrying range likely play a role in helping packs avoid each other and maintain exclusive territories. The calling often begins with a single lone call rising and falling in the wind. But soon other members of the clan feel compelled to join in. It's a very social activity. We see this today even in domestic dogs. Take any street at night where most of the houses have dogs. If one dog starts barking, within a minute another joins in, and another, and soon the street is full of barking dogs. And the dogs aren't being aggressive towards each other. They're sharing in a communal activity that they inherited from their ancient ancestors. It's hard not to be reminded of how we as humans feel compelled to sing along with other musicians. Now, it is often the case that animals that use the most complex vocal displays in defending a territory, whether solo or as part of a group, are also animal species that don't appear to use scent marking to advertise ownership of a territory. The most obvious examples of these, again, among birds and primates. Animals that use scent to mark their territories are not simply advertising their ownership of a territory by way of their scent, although that is its primary function. But rivals are also able to distinguish between individuals based on the scent. So it also serves as an identity marker, allowing individuals to distinguish between their different neighbours and their neighbours from outside intruders whom they have never met before. And the idea is that in species that lack the use of scent as a marker for identity, then vocalization may sometimes take over this role too. For example, among chimps, it has been observed that neighbouring groups will sometimes vary their group vocalizations so as to better distinguish themselves from other groups. So, what might this model tell us about the development of rhythm in humans? This ability to entrain one's movements and sounds to an external, common beat. Hagen and Hammerstein argue that one reason that animals that live in social groups vocalize together is because this displays the size of the coalition to any intruders. In most cases, if one group significantly outnumbers the other, then the smaller of the two coalitions will retreat. However, there are times when the two groups are more closely matched, and even times when a coalition of slightly fewer individuals might win when fighting a slightly larger group. What often plays a significant role in these cases is the relative strength of the coalition rather than its size. Coalition strength is basically how well the members perform as a group, as a single organism, how strong their bonds are, how much time they have spent together. A group of individuals who are able to cooperate to a very high degree are likely to outmaneuver a larger but less coordinated group. Individuals who have very strong bonds and who will try to save one another or even die for one another make a more formidable opponent than a group of individuals who are not prepared to go to such lengths. So the argument is that there would be a selective advantage to displays that not only communicate the size of the group, but also the strength of the coalition, how interconnected these individuals are. In the context of these territorial displays, this is communicated immediately if individuals can synchronize their calls and their movements. And to synchronize, they would have to be sharing a common beat, or more generally, a common sense of timing. This kind of synchronized display is almost impossible to fake on the spot by a group of individuals who have no connection, as it requires a great deal of coordination and it takes time to develop and to learn. It indicates time spent together, communal bonds, a common will and intention. And the communal learning of displays has the additional benefit of further strengthening group bonds. And in fact, there are those who have posited that it may be the case that Hagen and Hammerstein have their model backwards, that vocalizing and Even synchronized vocalizing may have emerged first as a form of bonding within the group, and its use in territorial displays came later. In this view, communal vocalization might be similar to grooming behavior among primates. Grooming together, playing together, and perhaps even vocalizing together are key in the formation of social networks within primate groups. An individual within a group may already have demonstrated an ability to hunt or to defend or to find food, but the fact that they can do these things does not tell you that they will use these skills for the benefit of the group, or who they will choose to benefit if they have to make a choice between two or more individuals. This is where grooming and other similar communal activities come in. This is where individuals develop relationships. Who spends time with who in these activities is a much better indicator of who is going to help who in a crisis situation, and they are key to the social cohesion of the group. So, if early hominids did exhibit synchronized displays in territorial disputes with other groups, it's likely that the power of such displays came from the fact that these displays don't just display group cohesion. They display group cohesion precisely because they also create group cohesion in the first place. And this scenario perhaps has a little more of the ring of truth to it. After all, it does seem a bit of a stretch to imagine that such territorial displays might have been the original and primary driver behind the growing entrainment and rhythmicization of humans. But it's not quite that much of a stretch to instead imagine that if such communal entrainment did develop as part of an early form of hominin sociality, that early humans would have engaged in some form of synchronized display of this kind in conflicts, in defending territories, and that these would likely have been very effective defense mechanisms. We need only look at the effect that such displays have on us as animals. There is a scene that starkly demonstrates this in the 2007 movie 300, which is basically an imaginative retelling of the story of the Battle of Thermopylae. Now, in this scene, the army of the 300 Spartans joins an allied army of some 5,000 Achaeans to go off and fight the Persian army together. Now, the leader of these Achaeans is disappointed at how small the Spartan contingent is, and basically calls into question Sparta's commitment to the war to Leonidas's face, who is leading the contingent of the 300. Now, Leonidas, the king of the Spartans, or more precisely one of the two kings of the Spartans, because the Spartans had two kings, he responds in a very interesting way. He turns first to the other Achaean soldiers in the front line and asks each what his profession is. One is a potter, the other is a sculptor, and so on. Leonidas then turns to his 300 men and, addressing them as a whole, asks them the same question. Here is how it plays out.
Daxos! What a pleasant surprise.
This morning's full of surprises, Leonidas.
We've been tricked. There'll be more than a few hundred of them. This is a surprise.
Silence!
This isn't an army.
We heard Sparta was on the warpath. We were eager to join forces.
If it is blood you seek, welcome to join us.
But you bring only this handful of soldiers against Xerxes? You see, I was wrong to expect Sparta's commitment to at least match our own.
Doesn't it? You, there. What is your profession?
I'm a potter, sir.
And you, Akkadian. What is your profession?
Sculptor, sir.
You?
Blacksmith.
Spartans! What is your profession? You see, old friend, I brought more soldiers than you did.
Now, after hearing that, which of the two do you feel is the stronger army? By responding with that synchronized triple call, the Spartans demonstrate a unity that the other Achaeans can't match. It shows that they will fight as one. It shows the time they have spent together, training, bonding, and it shows their readiness to follow their king. Leonidas is basically making the point that Sparta may have sent less men, but its contribution to the battle is greater than that of any of the other Greek armies. Now, regardless of what you may think of the rest of the film, this particular scene is an example of very perceptive writing, whether the writers were aware of this or not, because it communicates its point in what is, in effect, the briefest and most direct way possible. We all get what it is that the Spartans are communicating. There is something quite specific about the triple call. If you think about it, had the Spartans responded with only one call or only two calls, the effect would not have been the same. A grouping of 3 repeating sounds is, in essence, the smallest sound unit that we can realistically perceive as a rhythm, as having a pattern. Let's take, for instance, a sequence of 2 sounds. Are these sounds being played in time? Are they regularly spaced? We have no idea, because there is nothing else to compare them to. But if instead we play the sound 3 times, then now there are 2 gaps that occur between the sounds, and these pauses have equal duration. So we know that the sounds are being played in a regular pattern, that they are equally spaced, or what we call in time. And we perceive the whole as a very small rhythm. Just like that. And if you want to see contemporary examples of synchronized displays, you need to look no further than military parades today and their complex exhibitions of rigid synchronization. Now, Hagen and Hammerstein also argue that synchronized displays might have played a role not only in confrontations between groups, but also in fostering bonds and developing alliances between groups, which is a very peculiarly human behavior, that one of forming larger alliances between familial groups. Music has the ability to transmit emotional information to whole groups, just as it creates a common emotional state within a group of people, strengthening bonds between the group members. Now, among the animals, only humans are known to engage in these alliances between groups on a regular and widespread basis. But it has been observed sometimes also in a handful of other mammal species, most notably bottlenose dolphins, who are one of the few animals other than humans who also engage in synchronized displays. Again, possibly as a way of strengthening bonds or coordinating group behavior across groups. In their case, naturally, we're talking about displays of synchronized swimming, for which they're very famous. Now, Hagen and Hammerstein's thesis might also shed light on the ways in which we engage with music, why we find improvisation so captivating, for example, or the thrill that we feel when watching a group of musicians playing very complex interlocking parts in perfect coordination. We often talk about groups of musicians playing as if they can read each other's minds, or that they play together as if they're one person. Hagen and Hammerstein would argue that we find this particular aspect of music so compelling because on a deep level we recognize the coalition strength demonstrated by the group, how connected they are, and that this might have sparked some sort of arms race that galvanized the early development of proto-music, with each group trying to outdo the other. The more complex the display, with all kinds of offbeat accents and rhythmic interplay, then the greater the coalition strength demonstrated. And this love of rhythmical complexity still finds expression in the modern musics of cultures all around the world, such as what we're listening to now, which is an absolutely insane example of Ogene playing from Nigeria. I'm going to put links in the description if you want to hear more, and you definitely should check them out. I mean, this is world-class musicianship right here. I mean, this stuff is crazy good. Now, we've spent quite a while here talking about rhythm, and yet there are countless forms of music around the world that are not based on any kind of easily recognizable rhythmical pattern. And this isn't a recent trend by any means. Music with a much more liquid approach to time has been around since the days of the earliest wind chimes. And in fact, most likely, it was there before the more structured, rhythmical approach to sound making that we now find commonly in music, and has been there all throughout the history of world musics. And so here we come to the real issue when discussing theories on the origins of music. Music is extremely multifaceted. It excites us and it soothes us. We make music to express sadness and to express joy, and it is ubiquitous. Not only do we find it in all cultures, we find it in virtually all aspects of the lives of cultures and individuals. In the words of Wallen, Merker and Brown, however it was that we came to have music, we found incredible uses for it. In fact, it became part of all our activities and helped to define what those activities were. We make music to sing babies to sleep, to make work go by easier, to enhance play, or to strengthen group bonds, or to express aggression towards other groups. We are moved by music both metaphorically and literally when we dance. It underscores and defines all the most important moments of individual and cultural life, from celebrating marriages to mourning death. It is tied to religious observance, and in pre-literate societies it even functions as a form of record keeping, as a way of memorizing things. We would be very different creatures without music. Our ability and instinct for music, in a sense, precede us as a species. They define us. Right at the start of this episode, I said that humans have been asking themselves where their music comes from ever since they have been conscious of making music. I didn't just say since they've been making music, but since they have been aware of making music. Humans were likely making what we might recognize as a rudimentary form of musical expression long before they were conscious of it as such. Even today, this happens to us all the time on a much smaller scale. Sometimes we may be humming a melody or tapping a rhythm without even being conscious of it. And then suddenly something brings us back into awareness and we catch ourselves doing it. Examples such as these show us that consciousness, or better self-awareness as we think of it, is not required to make music at this most basic level. It's just something we do. In a sense, we might say that our capacity for music, and even our capacity for other things which we often view as being the pinnacle of consciousness or intellect, that these in fact precede the kind of consciousness that we mean when we talk about humans being conscious, and that they are necessary prerequisites to it. So, just as music can be found in all aspects of human life, it is likely that the origins of music lie in all aspects of the lives of our early ancestors. Not one origin, but many. And so there are also many theories, each looking at different aspects of music, or different aspects of the behaviors of humans. Some of these theories may stand the test of time, many almost certainly will not. But their value lies not so much in providing an answer to our question, which, in its most profound aspects, will almost certainly always remain an open question. Their value lies rather in giving us different ways of exploring the question itself, and in the different ways that they allow us to think about music. The question, for example, of why we feel compelled to join in when listening to music is not one that a class on music theory is equipped to consider. We must think about music in a very different way to explore that topic. And there are other ways too of exploring these fundamental questions that aren't even evolutionary. These might be cultural or philosophical or spiritual or religious. We will get into these once we start looking at the musics of different cultures. Now, each of these different evolutionary theories should not necessarily be viewed as being in competition with one another, but more often as standing simply side by side, providing different ways of looking at music and forming part of a larger picture. We said, for example, that singing behavior is correlated with monogamy in the animal kingdom. Now, monogamy is extremely rare among mammals, and yet all singing primates so far have been observed to be monogamous. And what about humans? We certainly do exhibit certain forms of monogamous behavior, although not in all cultures and not at all times. But could it be that the evolution of singing in humans bears some relation to the evolution of a certain kind of aptitude for monogamous behaviors? This may be yet another small piece of the puzzle. Similarly, we might say that Hagen and Hammerstein's hypothesis that communal chorus calling was one of the drivers behind the evolution of music does not necessarily deny the sexual aspect. In fact, I think that you would be hard-pushed to find someone who wouldn't agree that there is a profoundly sexual dimension to music, and Hagen and Hammerstein recognize this also. After all, even if, as current evidence suggests, sexual selection did not play a significant role in the evolution of music, and we can still suppose that once certain musical behaviors had evolved, such as the ability to synchronize with others, that any such desirable traits could become something to show off or to use as a display when courting a mate. And in fact, even today, we find that music is both a communal activity and a solo display, often at the exact same time. Group performances often feature soloists who draw the audience's attention to themselves by dazzling displays of virtuosity and expression. Often within a group of musicians, there may be one member who is fairly self-evidently more prominent than the rest, one whose performances stand out a little more, or who connects more with the audience, often a singer or a soloing musician. So we see that music is very often both a group performance and a solo display at the same time. The two coexist perfectly well together. So, to try and wrap things up, before I just go on and on and on and on listing all the different ways in which these things could be and have been interpreted, what is the takeaway from all this? It seems to me that a useful way to think about this is that when we talk about music, we're not necessarily talking about one thing, but about many interrelated things, which we group together under a single term. It is, after all, true that not all cultures share our same concept of music. In some cultures, the things that we describe as music are viewed as distinct categories, sometimes maybe to distinguish music that people dance to from music that is not made for dance. Conversely, in other cultures, music itself is not necessarily seen as a distinct category, but as part of a larger whole, and may be viewed as not being distinguishable or separate from things such as dance or ritual or incantations, or poetry or storytelling, or even magic. Now for today, this is where we'll have to stop. Mainly because of how long this episode is getting. But for those of you who are familiar with some of the things that I've been discussing today, you may have noticed a glaring omission. one which I only alluded to when I compared music to language. I was hoping to include it in today's topic, but as I was working on this episode, I could see that it was already getting pretty long, so I've decided to dedicate what hopefully will be a shorter and easier for me episode specifically on music language, which will be the next in the series. And I would like to leave you with a thought from a short essay by the real OGs, Wallen, Merker and Brown, found right at the end of The Origins of Music. They tell us to listen to music, not just to listen to music, but to listen to music. In other words, to what it is telling us about ourselves.